So dear beloved community, it's such a joy to be together with you. I hope that each of you is well and happy and safe wherever you might be at this moment in time. We've made it to the 19th of July in the year 2020, and that's truly something to celebrate. It's so wonderful to have a chance to sit together and to be surrounded by the energy of the Sangha, the energies of mindfulness, the energies of joy, the energies of peace. I was telling a story earlier today to friends who came here to Mountain Spring for the Day of Mindfulness about a dream I had many years ago when in the dream, Tay came to me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, well, Brother Phapai, is it yes or is it no? And in the dream, I turned to Tay and I said, yes, it's yes, Tay. And when I think back to that dream, I realized that our teacher can come to us in many forms, whether it's Tay or whether it's the teacher of each moment that's presenting itself to us, a situation, an encounter. And in each moment, we have the opportunity to say yes, or we have the opportunity to say no. And for me, that dream was a reminder that as a practitioner, I want to say yes to opening myself fully to each moment, just as it is, to live my life fully, to live my life completely, to be fully alive and fully present. And I think it's also important to reflect on another aspect of this dream that I had. And that is, if we're asked, what's the answer, yes or no? We need to ask the question, what am I saying yes to? And so in each and every moment when we have an encounter, whether it's a difficult situation or we're meeting a certain sense input, as we've talked about a few weeks ago, to ask ourselves what it is we're saying yes to or what it is we're saying no to in each moment. I've been very excited about sharing with you my reflections on the next aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path this evening. We're going to be continuing along on the next stage of our exploration. We move from the wisdom or prajna section of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is, as we shared in previous talks, both the beginning of the path and the culmination, the end of the path, is if such an end is indeed something that we envisage. We move from that section, the prajna section, into the exploration of the sila or ethics portion of the Noble Eightfold Path. The next three path factors that we'll be exploring together, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, collectively make up the ethics or sila portion. And they're often treated together as the ethics or sila group. In Pali, it's called the sila kanda, the body of, or the collection of ethics or sila. It's important to remember as we dive into this ethics section of the Noble Eightfold Path, that although the principles in this section focus on our inner and outer conduct and relations, please remember that the ultimate purpose here is not ethics for ethics' sake, but rather within the context of the Noble Eightfold Path, and more specifically, within the context of our spiritual path. These three limbs of the path, the three limbs that make up the Sila Kanda or the ethics portion of the Noble Eightfold Path, are not there simply to help us focus on our actions, but primarily, or their primary purpose, is to help us transform our mind and our heart, our entire being. In the special context of the Noble Eightfold Path, ethical principles need to be seen in the overall context of our goal as spiritual practitioners, which is what? I don't know about you, but my goal is to wake up to my real situation and to transform my own suffering and to help others. So I shared a few weeks ago, last week when we looked at right intentionality, and then a number of weeks ago when we looked at volition as a form of nutriment, I shared of the importance of asking ourselves why we're a practitioner, what it is we're looking for, and whether we can touch that right in the here and now. So with this, we see that the end goal, just like the Noble Eightfold Path, the very beginning is the end. It's able to be touched in every moment. So it's important to ask ourselves what it is we're looking for, and to see the Noble Eightfold Path within our own life, and within the context of our goal as a spiritual practitioner, the goal of transforming our heart. In order for the ethical training to become a proper part of our overall spiritual path and transformation, and more importantly, to be noble, as in the Noble Eightfold Path. Again, it's not called the Eightfold Path. It's called the Noble Eightfold Path. Then the Sila or ethics section has to be practiced alongside the first two factors, the wisdom section. The first two factors being right or complete or clear view, and right intention. And not to stop there in the sense of ethics for ethics' sake, but to lead onwards to the trainings in concentration and in wisdom. As friends who have been in the Tuesday night sutra class have discovered, the training in ethics in Buddhism is actually seen as the foundation for the entire path. It's seen as being essential for the success of the other trainings. Once when a person approached the Buddha and asked for the training in brief, like the whole of the practice in brief, the Buddha said to him, first establish yourself firmly in beneficial states. That is, in beneficial behavior and in right view. Then when your view is clearer, you should practice the four foundations of mindfulness. The Pali word that we've been translating as ethics, sila, it has several meanings, and they're all associated with right conduct. In earlier talks, I've mentioned that in Buddhist psychology, the function of ethical behavior is to help transform the root of ill will and to cultivate a mind of love towards ourselves and to others. This is so foreign to our usual way of looking at ethics. We tend to look at ethics as a set of restrictions or commandments, things that we should do. But rather in Buddhism, we see ethics or mindfulness trainings, if we're more comfortable with that term, or precepts, as a concrete manifestation of love and insight, especially the Buddha's insight. In fact, when the Buddha was passing away and people asked him where they would find their teacher or who would be their teacher now that the Buddha was no longer going to be with them, the Buddha responded, if you would like to meet me, then I can be found in the mindfulness trainings. Take the mindfulness trainings as your teacher. Take ethical trainings or ethics as your teacher. If you visit a Plum Village center, one of our Plum Village centers worldwide, and you notice the stained glass in the meditation hall, you'll notice that the wording of the threefold training on the stained glass is a little bit different than the traditional threefold training. Traditionally, it's Sila, Samadhi, Prajna. And in Plum Village, you will see Smrti, which is mindfulness, and then Samadhi, which is concentration, and then Prajna. So rather than ethics, concentration, and insight, you see mindfulness, concentration, and insight. This is because if we practice mindfulness correctly, it always has an ethical component. It has this ethical component in the sense that mindfulness will naturally, if it's applied correctly, always lead us in the direction of acting in love and non-harm towards ourselves and others. In fact, our teacher Tay has shared with us that we can actually see that the nature of mindfulness is love. Coming back to the word sila itself, in the context of this Noble Eightfold Path, sila can be seen in a few different ways. Firstly, in the sense of precepts or principles, which represent the formal aspects of the ethical training. So things such as the 5 mindfulness trainings, the 14 trainings of the Order of Interbeing, the precepts of a monastic, and so on. So that's the formal aspect of the ethical training. And then the second way to look at sila is sila as the beautiful quality of heart and mind that's cultivated through the practice of mindfulness. So the quality of, I guess you could say, virtue, the virtue itself, that when we behave ethically, we have this sense of love and care. So that sense of virtue. And then a third way to look at sila or ethical conduct in Buddhism is as right conduct, which is the outward expression of virtue in real life situations. So in some commentaries, in some of the sub-commentaries, sila is defined as abstinence from unwholesome bodily and verbal action. This definition, which seems to me to have a focus on outer action, appears to me to be a little superficial and not yet complete, because there are a lot of subtle layers to the cultivation of sila, of ethics. It is a deep practice, not just only on the layer of physical action and verbal action, although already looking at those layers of behavior is fantastic. There's more to discover. If we just focus on the outer layers, it's already good. But sila, ethical behavior, transforms us in really profound ways. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, for those of us in the West, the English word morality or even ethics carries with it a sense of obligation and constraint, which is quite different to the Buddhist view or the Buddhist approach to ethics or sila. In fact, all the commentaries and books and things that have been written in analysis of sila or ethics in Buddhism can be summed up in the following phrase, and that's: refrain from harming yourself and others, cultivate every beneficial quality in yourself and others, and purify your mind and heart. So Buddhism grounds its ethics not on the notion of obedience, but on two aspects which must be cultivated together in order to be seen as complete. By the way, I want to mention something about this word obedience, which sounds so heavy in English. Often when we go back to the root of some of these difficult and heavy words, words that we react to, we discover something quite amazing. The root of obedience is in Latin. The Latin is actually ob audire. And in Latin, it means to hear fully. Audire means hear. So to hear fully. So in this sense, obedience from that root, ob audire, means if we truly listen deeply, then it's natural to respond. That's quite a different way of approaching obedience than our usual sense in the West, to practice listening deeply so we know how to respond. And I would say that this practice of listening deeply, opening a space of availability and responding in a way appropriate to the situation is the real heart of ethics and very much in line with our Plum Village practice. But the two aspects of ethics which really need to go together in the Buddhist way of thinking for our ethics to be complete is refraining, or in Pali it's varita, and then performing, which is charita. So the first is refraining from harming ourselves or others. And then the second is performing acts of benefit or healing for ourselves and others. That if we only get caught in the mindset that ethics is refraining from things, that our ethics is seen, or our sila is seen to be incomplete. But also we need to be performing acts of loving kindness, of benefit and healing for ourselves and for others. That this is the other wing of the bird of ethics, of sila. And also there's an aspect of sila, of ethics, that is considered to be harmony. This is the other aspect. In fact, some of the commentaries refer to sila by another word, samadhana, which means harmony or coordination. And I like that too, that in a way, it shows that the way that we're acting in the world, whether by our thoughts, our speech, our bodily action, is not uncoordinated, that everything's connected. Everything's unified. So the concrete practice of sila, whether through the 5 mindfulness trainings, the 14 mindfulness trainings, the bodhisattva precepts, or the monastic precepts, in a sense, I guess we could say, leads to harmony at several levels. Perhaps the social level, perhaps the psychological level, action level, our way of relating in the world, and meditative level. In fact, in Buddhism, this is when somebody is called noble, or when our spiritual journey is called noble. And that is when we're united, when we're coordinated, when all of these layers of our being are harmonized. The section of ethics in the Noble Eightfold Path, which we're about to dive into together, contains 3 factors, as I mentioned before: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And as a whole, this section, the Sila section of the Noble Eightfold Path, focuses on the 2 principal channels of outer action, our speech and our bodily behavior, as well as another area, our way of earning a living, our livelihood. So why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell, coming back to our bodies, coming back to our breath, just being fully present for ourselves in this moment. So that little introduction will hopefully give us a sense of the Buddhist view of ethics, just a little taste of how we approach ethics as an act of love and not a sense of obligation. And tonight and for this coming week in the Compassionate Ocean Sangha, we'll be looking at aspects of right or complete speech, or in the Pali language, samma vacha. There's a story that I love a lot. It's of a wise rabbi, and he was giving a talk about a small piece of flesh, just a few inches long, that had the possibility to create damage everywhere to all levels of society. The rabbi was sharing with the congregation that this small piece of flesh, just a few inches long, should be used very carefully and judiciously and only with a lot of consideration. And he went on in quite a lot of detail, and people's minds were speculating in all kinds of directions. And then the rabbi asked people what they thought that piece of flesh was. People, of course, had various guesses, as you can imagine. I'll leave it up to you. But nobody guessed the truth, that the rabbi was actually talking about the tongue. Right speech, sammavacha, or in Pali language, in most Buddhist texts is traditionally presented in a sort of I guess you could say, a negative way, with 4 practices to avoid. The Buddha shared very succinctly in the following way. He said, what is right speech? abstaining from false speech, from divisive speech, from abusive speech, and from idle chatter. This is called right speech. So once again, the Buddha was very concise, and I will be a little less concise. The Buddha explains right speech in the text, in the Pali Canon, as not speaking something that's not beneficial, and only speaking what's true and beneficial when the circumstances are right, whether they're welcome or not. So that's a really important consideration. Only speaking what's true and beneficial when the circumstances are right, whether they're welcome or not. And it's a really tall order, isn't it? It requires a lot of discernment about whether, first of all, whether what we're sharing is true, and that humbling aspect of that contemplation, of realizing that the knowledge we currently have of any situation or another person is most likely not ultimate truth. It's only a really, really small reflection of a tiny aspect of the situation. And then the other reflection of, is it beneficial for, and in what way is it beneficial? Is it the kind of shadow side where I kind of tell myself that it's beneficial for another person, but I'm actually trying to create that person in my own image? Or is it actually something that's beneficial? Requires some deep discernment. And then whether the circumstances are right. Is it the right moment? Who else is around? How is the person that I'm wanting to share with feeling in this moment? How am I feeling? Am I centered? Am I feeling a sense of irritation or obligation? What's going on? And then the final consideration is whether they're welcome or not. And for those of us who've taken the Order of Interbeing trainings, who are members of the Order of Interbeing, there's that mindfulness training that we have of speaking out about situations of injustice, even when doing so may make difficulties for us or threaten our safety. It's so easy, as Audre Lorde says, for us to sit in our corners and remain mute forever, always waiting for somebody else to speak, because if we speak, we know that we may have difficulties. But with these considerations, as the Buddha presented in the Pali Canon, we go through this process of consideration. And then if we have the insight that this is the right moment, that we do have something to contribute to the situation, then our words are precious and needed. And it's needed for us to speak up. And rather than just contributing to the noise, they're words that can penetrate the heart. The Buddha shared with us that right speech has 4 aspects in the short verse from the Pali Canon that we just heard before. The first is not engaging in false speech, and then not engaging in divisive speech, not engaging in harsh or abusive speech, and abstaining from idle chit-chat. So because the effects of speech are not as evident as those of bodily action, we can often overlook it. But if we look a little bit more deeply, speech and its connected, deeply connected offshoot, the written word, can have an enormous impact for good or for harm. In fact, for us humans, we're constantly immersed in verbal communication, and this is incredibly important. Speech is incredibly important. Speech can heal, it can create peace, it can share wisdom, or it can bring deep hurt and division, or even start wars. Now, in our modern times, the positive and negative potentials of speech have been multiplied many hundreds of times, mainly by the increase in speed and range and amount of communications. In Plum Village practice, we have a gatha, a short mindfulness poem that we reflect on every time we use the phone, or when it was written, it was called the gatha for using the telephone. I think it might be helpful to reflect on this gatha every time we text somebody, or we're about to comment on a Facebook post or another form of social media. The world and our engagement with technology is moving along at a rapid pace. I had to smile last year when we had the teen camp in Deer Park Monastery, where I was living at the time. I was listening to two young teenagers talking about their families, and one teenager said to the other, "Yeah, my mother called me like a psycho." And then I thought to myself, this is so interesting. And I asked them, and they said, well, nobody calls each other anymore. They just text, which is quite different to when I was growing up. So we might need to consider this gatha not only as a gatha for talking on the telephone, but also for whenever we text somebody, or whenever we, especially perhaps when we want to comment on a social media post. So the gatha reads, words can travel thousands of miles. May my words create mutual understanding and love. May they be as beautiful as gems, as lovely as flowers. So this is the verse that we contemplate, or we were contemplating whenever we're using the phone, or perhaps these days whenever we're going to be engaged in a sustained act of communication. May my words create understanding and love. May they be as beautiful as gems, as lovely as flowers. The fourth mindfulness training in Plum Village's reading, it sums up our whole approach to the practice of right speech very beautifully. It says, aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others, I'm committed to cultivating loving speech and compassionate listening in order to relieve suffering and to promote reconciliation and peace in myself and among other people, ethnic and religious groups, and nations. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I am committed to speaking truthfully, using words that inspire confidence, joy, and hope. When anger is manifesting in me, I'm determined not to speak. I will practice mindful breathing and walking in order to recognize and to look deeply into my anger. I know that the roots of anger can be found in my wrong perceptions and lack of understanding of the suffering in myself and in the other person. I will speak and listen in a way that can help myself and the other person to transform suffering and to see the way out of difficult situations. I'm determined not to spread news that I do not know to be certain and not to utter words that can cause division or discord. I will practice right diligence to nourish my capacity for understanding, love, joy, and inclusiveness, and gradually transform anger, violence, and fear that lie deep in my consciousness. This mindfulness training is incredibly complete, and it's a life's work to reflect on and to apply in our lives. And I love the fact that this mindfulness training is called loving speech and deep listening, because we have one mouth and two ears, but let's face it, we often behave as if we have two mouths and only one ear. Perhaps we can enjoy another sound of the bell. It was Yasir Qadhi who said, the tongue is only a small, soft piece of flesh, and yet it's capable of breaking the strongest bonds and destroying the most powerful of relationships. So why don't we together have a look at the 4 aspects that by looking at them generate right speech. Each of these aspects is contained in the 4th mindfulness training of Plum Village that we just read, the mindfulness training on loving speech and deep listening. The first of the 4 aspects is not engaging in false speech, or in Pali, musavada veramani, not engaging in false speech. So in other words, not engaging in fake news. The Buddha said in this practice, someone avoids false speech and abstains from it. They speak the truth. They're devoted to the truth. They're reliable. They're worthy of confidence. They're not a deceiver of others. Being at a meeting, amongst people, or in the midst of their relatives, or in a society, or when called upon and asked as a witness to tell what they know in court, they answer clearly and straight away. If they know nothing, they say, I know nothing. And if they know something, they answer, I know. Thus, they never knowingly speak an untruth or a lie, either for the sake of their own advantage, or for the sake of another person's advantage, or for the sake of any advantage whatsoever. So this statement of the Buddha shares both the wholesome and the not yet wholesome aspects of the training in right speech. The unwholesome side is, of course, abstaining from lying, but the positive side is speaking the truth. The determinative factor in this aspect of right speech is the intention to deceive. If we share something false, but at the time we believe it to be true, then the intention to deceive somebody is not there. It's just part of being human, part of knowing that the knowledge that we currently possess is not changeless, absolute truth. Though the intention of hiding or deceiving is common in most cases of false speech can appear in different ways depending on which of the 3 main roots motivated the false speech. And this is a very helpful reflection for all of us to do. The 3 roots that could motivate false speech are, of course, as we've discussed before, the root of greed, this mind of or heart of always wanting to acquire something or get something, the root of ill will or hatred or aversion, or the root of delusion, one of those 3 roots. And it can be really helpful to reflect if we notice that we're engaging in false speech. It can be very helpful to look at the speech we uttered and consider from which root did that motivation arise, to start to understand the functioning of these 3 roots in our consciousness in a very concrete way. So greed as the main motivation produces false speech aimed at gaining some advantage for ourselves or for those close to us, whether it's material wealth or position or respect or admiration or something like that. With the root of hatred or ill will or aversion as the main motivation, then false speech will take the form of some kind of malicious lie or untruth or stretching of the truth. Some kind of speech intended to hurt or to damage others. And with the root of delusion as the principal motivation, then a result might be exaggeration or false speech for the sake of a joke and so on. The Buddha emphasized cultivating right speech for a number of reasons. For one thing, as we've seen lately, unfortunately, false or fake news damages social cohesion and mutual trust and solidarity, and it leads to hurt, and eventually kind of keep going. It leads to a sense of, from that hurt and that lack of cohesion, it leads to a sense of chaos. But false speech has other consequences of a deeply personal nature. By their very nature, false speech or untruths or lies, they tend to proliferate, they tend to grow. And we definitely see this in the current moment, right? If we engage in false speech, we end up feeling compelled to defend ourselves, to defend our credibility, or to try to paint a consistent picture of events. And so the process repeats itself. The lies or the untruths stretch, they multiply and they connect until we get locked in a cage of falsehoods from which it's difficult to escape. So in this way, false speech is a microcosm of the whole process of subjective illusion, our process of creating suffering, creating a false story. The creator, sucked in by their own deceptions, eventually winds up as the victim, whether it's through false speech or it's through this continual creation of a story. So I'll leave it up to your own insight whether this might describe one or two well-known people at this moment in time. With this background of understanding the many layers and implications of false speech, there's one time the Buddha spoke to his son Rahula, soon after Rahula was ordained as a novice monk. One day the Buddha came to him and pointed to a bowl with a little bit of water in it and said, "Rahula, do you see the little bit of water left in this bowl?" And Rahula said, "Yes, well, of course I see that." And the Buddha said, "Well, just like that, so little, Rahula, is the spiritual achievement of one who's not committed to practicing right speech." Then the Buddha threw the water away and put the bowl down and said, "Do you see, Rahula, how the water has been discarded, has been thrown away by me?" In the same way, one who engages in deliberate falsehood, deliberate untruth, throws away any spiritual attainment that she's made. Again, he said, "Do you see, Rahula, how this bowl is empty now?" In the same way, someone who doesn't have any remorse in speaking falsely is empty of any spiritual achievement. And then finally, the Buddha turned the bowl upside down and said, "Do you see, Rahula, that the bowl is now upside down?" In the same way, somebody who engages in falsehood turns their spiritual practice upside down and becomes incapable of progress. So this is quite a strong teaching from Buddha, isn't it? And I want, why did the Buddha emphasize right speech so much, or the importance of speech so heavily? Perhaps one reason for this might be a profound reason. And it might be that the commitment to truth transcends just the everyday ethics in terms of our just everyday behavior, or even the transformation of our mind in a sense, and takes us to a deeper layer. Right speech, of course, provides in the area of interpersonal communication a parallel to wisdom in the meditative realm. The two are respectively the outward and the inward aspects of the same commitment to what is real, what is true. If we're a meditator, we're committed to finding out what's real, of touching reality, of touching the truth. And every part of ourselves needs to reflect the other. If we want to seek the truth, to see the true nature of reality, the true nature of our own mind and the world around us, then our commitment to reality needs to express itself through all of the doors of action, through our mind, through our body, and through our speech. Wisdom, or waking up, consists in the realization of truth. Right and truth, or satya in the Pali language, is not just a word, but it's really the nature of things just as they are. And I've shared repeatedly in the series of talks that I've been giving that the Buddha always taught in a holistic manner. He taught in a way that invited us to bring our whole selves to our spiritual path, and not to consider our spiritual path as something that we just do on the cushion and we can do whatever in daily life and the two don't connect, but to actually have this transformation flow through all the different aspects of our life. So to realize truth, or to be able to touch truth, or to touch something real, then our whole being has to be brought into alignment with reality, with things as they really are. Which, of course, if we're looking in the realm of speech, means that in our communications with others and also with ourselves, we practice speaking the truth. So right speech, in a way, establishes an affinity between our own inner being and the real nature of phenomena, allowing wisdom, or this sense of truth, or just a little bit more understanding of the nature of something to rise up. So much more than just a dry ethical principle or right behavior on an outward level. On a more profound level, the devotion or the practice of right speech or truthful speech is a matter of committing ourselves, body and mind, fully to reality, to truth, rather than to illusion, or committing ourselves to insight and wisdom, rather than fantasies and delusion. So this is one reason why I feel that the Buddha really emphasized right speech. So the second is, in addition to abstaining from false speech, the second of the four aspects is abstaining from divisive speech. Pisunaya vachaya veramani. So let me break this technical phrase, this technical term down for you, dear friends. For the most part, this abstaining from divisive speech is a fancy way of saying gossip. Oh, how delicious is gossip. Everybody loves a good piece of gossip. There's an old quote attributed to almost everybody that if you can't say anything nice, come and sit next to me. We all have this tendency at some part of ourselves. We like to hear, we like to be the first person to hear a bit of juicy information. You know that old situation where we have those three statues: see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. For many of us, it's kind of see no evil, speak no evil, but we're very willing to listen to it. We like to hear it. The Buddha summed up this aspect of right speech by saying the following: that practitioners avoid divisive speech and abstain from it. What has been heard here, they do not repeat over there, so as to cause dissension there. And what they've heard over there, they don't repeat here, so as to cause dissension here. In that way, they unite those who are divided, and those that are united, they encourage. Harmony gladdens them, they delight and they rejoice in harmony, and it is in harmony that they spread their words. So divisive speech is, of course, speech that's intended to create division at some level or another, to alienate one person or a group of people from another, or sometimes to ingratiate ourselves. The motive behind this kind of speech is generally the root of aversion or ill will or resentment, the intention to tear down others or damage them in some way. Some harsher motives might also manifest in this realm as well, such as intending to hurt others, or the desire to win affection for ourselves at the expense of others, or even for some people, the schadenfreude of seeing people divided. So the opposite of division, as the Buddha shares, is speech that promotes friendship and harmony, that brings people together. And such kind of communications, they originate from a mind of friendliness, from a mind of loving kindness. And also this beautiful quality of empathy and opening of the heart. This kind of speech brings about trust and affection in others, and that people can feel that they can confide in us without the feeling that whatever they share with us is going to later be used against them. So beyond the obvious benefits that speaking in this way will bring, in the text it says that abstaining from divisive speech will bring us a group of friends who can never be turned against us by others' wrong speech, that will be surrounded by wonderful people that are deeply supporting. Why don't we have a sound of the bell? So the third aspect of the four practices of right speech is abstaining from harsh or abusive speech. And then the Buddha said in the text that a practitioner avoids harsh language and abstains from it. They speak such words that are gentle, soothing to the ear, loving words that can go straight to the heart, and are courteous, friendly, and agreeable to many. So harsh speech basically is speech uttered in subtle or less subtle anger, intended, again, subtly or less subtly to cause another person pain. Such speech, harsh speech or abusive speech, can assume different forms, of which I'll just mention three to give you a sense of the general area. First is, of course, abusive speech, scolding, reviling, or reproving another angrily with bitter words. So, and we've all been in a situation where it might seem as if somebody's pouring boiling oil all over us. So we've all been in a situation where we've either been a subject of scolding or reproving, or we've also been the person offering that. As a teacher to our young ones, sometimes it's necessary to offer some strong words, but we have to be extremely aware as elder brothers when we're offering those kind of strong words, that it doesn't come, as much as possible, it doesn't come from anger or from irritation or wanting to hurt the person, but trying to help the person to see the situation. I'm reminded of a time a few years ago when we were walking in Deer Park. There was a brother who was new to Deer Park, the monastery in Southern California where I was living, and was not familiar with the poison oak that was there. And we were doing walking meditation together as a Sangha, and we were about to step into like a patch of poison oak. And that brother, within the space of the next step, was about to take a step right into the poison oak. And he would have ended up having a skin rash that would have spread out. It would have been incredibly painful. I had no time to be able to explain to him, dear brother, you're going to step into poison oak. The only thing I had time to do was very quickly to push him away from the poison oak. And of course, he was quite shocked when that happened. But then I explained to him, dear brother, this is poison oak. If you touch this plant, you'll probably end up with a very itchy and painful rash that will cover your skin, and it will last for quite a while and things like that. And then he was very grateful. So on one level, it was kind of a strong action, but on another level, it actually came from not wanting that brother to, in that situation, to be harmed. And I was able to explain that to the brother. So if we're, this first aspect is abusive speech. And we've all been in situations where we've been a recipient of that. And the second aspect of harsh speech is insult. Hurting another by giving them, ascribing to them some kind of offensive quality of them. So really putting them down in some way. And then the third aspect that is an aspect of harsh speech, which is a bit of a challenge for the Aussies out there, and I see you, is sarcasm. This kind of dry sarcasm. It's mentioned in the text. Speaking to someone in a way that on the surface kind of praises them, but with a little bit of a twist in there, kind of the ironic twist. In which it could be taken in another way as well. It's considered to be a form of harsh speech. So that being said, there's a deeper layer to speech. And I'm going to say it here, particularly as we look into this aspect. If it wasn't, in case it isn't already clear to all of us listening here, maybe it is. Thinking is the speech of our mind. Let me say it again. Thinking is the speech of our mind. And often the person we're most abusive towards, the person we are most harsh towards, is ourselves. The main root of harsh or abusive speech is, of course, aversion, this root of ill will. And it has many forms, but it's appearing here in the form of anger. And the ideal antidote to anger is patience and inclusiveness, learning to absorb criticism and be open to and absorb criticism from others, to empathize with others' shortcomings as we see them, because they may not be shortcomings at all, but when we see shortcomings in others, we empathize with it, to respect differences in viewpoint, and to endure or be able to be present just like the earth in some situations without feeling the need to retaliate immediately. The Buddha invites us to practice this sense of loving kindness, this sense of being like the earth, even in the most difficult situations, saying even if we're treated terribly, we should practice in the following way. Undisturbed shall my mind remain, with a heart full of love and free from any hidden malice, any hidden ill will. And that very person who at this moment in time is creating harm, I'll saturate with loving thoughts, with wide, deep, boundless, and freed from anger and hatred. And my absolute favorite, abstaining from idle chatter. They avoid idle chatter and they abstain from it. Speaking at the right time in accordance with facts, speaking what is useful, speaking of the Dharma. This speech is like a treasure, uttered at the right moment. Idle chatter is pointless talk, speech that lacks purpose or depth. There's a very technical term in French for this, so please get your pens ready. Since you'll want to look it up later, you really need to write this down. In French, it's called le blah blah. Idle chit-chat communicates nothing of value, but it only stirs up the issues and obstacles in our own mind and in others. The Buddha advises that we should look at our tendency to engage in idle chit-chat and practice speaking of matters of genuine importance. So what exactly is idle chit-chat? What did the Buddha mean when he was talking about idle chit-chat? I'm happy to tell you. It's one of my favorite lists in the Pali language. It's in the Pali canon. It's really one of my favorites. And I've spent a lot of time whiling away hours reading through and contemplating this list. It really brings me a lot of joy. So here are the topics that are considered to be idle chit chat. And I know I spoke about these in an earlier talk, but it's always fun to share it again. So conversations about kings, conversations about thieves and politicians, armies, alarms and disturbances and battles, food and drink, clothing, furniture, jewelry and scents, relatives, vehicles, villages, towns, cities, the countryside, men, women, and heroes, the gossip of the street, the gossip of the well, tales of the dead, this and that, the creation of the world and the sea, and talk of whether things really exist or they don't exist, or they both exist and don't exist. So there's not much to talk about, not much of our everyday conversation is left if we kind of analyze it against this list. In fact, we were not so long ago visiting the Blue Mountains Vihara, and on the wall of the hall in the Blue Mountains Vihara, there was a phrase that said, conversation should be of the Dharma. If it's not of the Dharma, let us maintain noble silence. So if we reflect on the list of unsuitable topics for conversation, topics that fall under idle chit chat, let's be honest, it's most of our conversational topics. Small talk to build rapport and connection is beautiful and wonderful and necessary. But one of the functions of this list and reflecting on these topics of conversation is to help us to ensure what root these topics of conversation are coming from. Are we speaking out of ill will? Are we speaking out of greed? Are we speaking from delusion, confusion, not understanding something clearly? So if we're engaging in idle chit chat, which root does it come from? As a teacher once said, if we have challenges to control our mouth, then we're probably going to have challenges to control our mind. So in Plum Village practice also, we try to avoid what we call triangle practice, talking or complaining to a third person about another. And we also have a mindfulness training as monastics, and that's to try not to talk about the faults of another person in their absence, except in the practice of shining light. This is a very powerful practice of communal harmony because everybody can feel safe. Everybody understands they're not going to be spoken about behind their back, that what is said to their face is what is said behind the back. The only real exception, there are two kind of exceptions in this. One is the elders of a community, the elder brothers or elder sisters, might be particularly the Dharma Teacher Council. From time to time, we might be considering together our mentees, our young ones, and we might be sharing about them in that context as elder brothers in the context of that meeting to say, this are some of the strengths and some of the challenges that this young one faces. What advice would you all have on how to help and support this young one? And the other situation might be if we're a mentor and we have a young one who is coming for a consultation, and they might be having an interpersonal difficulty with someone. As an elder brother, we'll listen to that and we'll offer them some advice on, maybe you might like to try this, you might like to try that. But it's quite a different, both of those examples are quite different from the example of just speaking about another person behind their back. It's both of those cases of speech in which there is the intention to be able to understand more fully, or the intention to bring people together, the intention to support rather than to tear down. So another aspect, of course, of idle chatter, this fourth aspect, idle chatter, is the idle chatter of the mind. Because before I was sharing about the fact that thinking is speech of the mind. And the fact that we tend to be quite harsh with the speech of the mind that we direct towards ourselves, and sometimes the speech of the mind that we direct towards others as well. And so it can be helpful to also consider, in terms of the speech of the mind, to consider how much of the speech of the mind fits into that list of idle chit-chat as well. I think we might find that it's a rather large percentage. And even more, you might find it helpful to consider how much of what is shared on TV or on social media fits into these categories of unhelpful speech or idle chit-chat. In one of the texts, there's a very beautiful meditative verse that talks a little bit about speech or right speech. And I'd like to end my sharing this evening with reading out this poem. It says, "Speak only the speech that doesn't torment yourself or do harm to others. That speech is truly well spoken. Speak only endearing speech, speech that is welcomed, speech when it brings no difficulties to self or to others is pleasant. Truth, indeed, is speech that will live forever. This is an ancient principle. Attaining the goal and the practice of the Dhamma are firmly established on truth. The speech that the awakened one, the Buddha, speaks is for the purpose of attaining liberation and rest, and for making an end to the mass of suffering, to the round of samsara. This is the supreme speech." So dear Noble community, I hope that this evening you were able to have a broader sense of what in the Noble Eightfold Path is meant by this practice of right or complete speech. It has so many aspects and layers, and only one aspect is to do with words that we're offering out with our mouth. It's so much deeper than that. And I'm excited to hear your reflections and to practice together with you over this next week as we look into these aspects of right or complete speech. Please take care of yourself wherever you are. Thank you so much for your sincere and heartfelt practice. It's been a joy to be together. So we'll end this evening's talk with a sound of the bell.